Thank you for joining Wars of the Roses. And this is The Story of the Koran by Manly P. Hall. An article from Horizon, the magazine of useful and intelligent living, winter 1953. The Story of the Koran by Manly P. Hall. The prevailing attitude of the non-Muslim world toward the teachings of the Prophet Mohammed is clearly revealed by the comparison of two definitions that appear in the 1953 edition of Webster's dictionary. Consider the following. New Testament, the covenant of God with man embodied with the coming of Christ and the teaching of Christ and his followers as set forth in the Bible. Koran, the scriptures of the Mohammedans containing the professed revelations to Mohammed. It is evident that the use of the word professed in reference to the Koran is intended to imply grave doubt as to the spiritual validity of the book and therefore of the religion founded thereon. Yet today the faith of Islam is practiced by approximately 255 million human beings and influences strongly the lives and policies of another 100 million. These figures may be regarded as conservative, although Muslims are more or less divided politically and their religion lacks the strong structural integration of Christianity. A definite pan-Islamic motion is noticeable. This is designed to meet the challenge of contemporary conditions, especially the threat of communism. It is interesting that the new head of the Egyptian government recently made a pilgrimage to Mecca, performed the 7 circumambulations of the Kaaba, and reverently kissed the black stone of Abraham. He also fulfilled other rites required or recommended by his faith. This direct commitment of himself in the Islamic world is being weighed by international observers on both the religious and political levels. From the Library of the Philosophical Research Society, Inc., illuminated leaf from an 18th century Koran. The word Koran, Arabic Quran, literally means recitation and indicates the method by which the surahs, or sections of the book, were revealed to the Prophet. Islam is translated submission, and the religion therefore proclaims itself as a faith of submission to the will of God. With a few clearly marked exceptions, the Quran is written in the first person and the speaker is God. The book deals with a variety of subjects, including theology, ethics, and jurisprudence. Idolatry and the deification of human beings are strictly condemned. Such religious observances as fasting and pilgrimage are established and defined. The Muslim legal code is founded upon the authority of the Quran, and this brings the religion into direct contact with the private citizen and the concerns of his daily living. The conflict between Christianity and Muslimism is the direct or indirect result of several factors present in both religions. The Mohammedan is considered fanatical because he insists that he follows the true faith revealed by God. He is unwilling and morally unable to compromise this position because to do so would endanger his mortal soul and destroy his hope for blessedness in the future life. Actually, there is nothing remarkable in this attitude which is shared by the members of most religious groups. The Arabs and somewhat later other Near Eastern and Far Eastern peoples were many of them highly emotional and given to military pursuits. It is inevitable that an aggressive following should not only encourage aggressive leadership, but should also affect the structure of the faith and the methods used in its promulgation. The Quran itself implies that it was revealed, at least in part, to correct the excesses and abuses which had arisen in the early Christian church, and this in no way endeared it to the medieval theologians of Europe. Perhaps the larger offense of Muhammad was his audacity in founding a religion after Christianity had proclaimed itself the universal church. Proximity also played a part. Other pagan religions were far removed in time or place. Islam flourished on the borders of Christendom and for centuries threatened the very survival of the Near Eastern Christian communities. It actually occupied and controlled the very territories sacred to the Christians and the Orthodox Jews. After the Crusades, the Holy Land, with its shrines and sacred places, passed gradually into the control of the Muslim world, and this certainly intensified Western antagonisms. Due to the general lack of communications, Europe was unable to cope with the motions in the religious and cultural spheres that were developing in the Near East. It never occurred to the churchmen of that day that their spiritual and temporal authority could ever be questioned. As part of their personal faith, they accepted the inevitable Christianizing of the entire earth. As this broad program of evangelism was according to the divine will, Muslimism could only be the work of the devil attempting to discomfit the righteous. A further and costly disillusionment came when the Saracens proved that they were more than a match for the armies of Christendom, and that even the holy relics carried by the Crusaders were of no avail. The victories of the Moors in Spain and the spread of Islam along the coast of North Africa brought the problem directly to the door of southern Europe. When Islamic culture began to affect European education, its liberalizing influence also caused grave concern among conservatives. As the result of these pressures, there was little time or inclination to analyze the possible contributions of Islam to world civilization. Even before the end of the medieval period, Christian scholars found it useful and practical to attend Moslem schools and to fraternize with the growing body of Eastern instructors. This tendency was especially pronounced among those mental liberals to whom Europe is indebted for much essential progress. Paracelsus, for example, found the scientists of Constantinople far better informed than the professors at Basel and Zurich. In the Rosicrucian allegory, the mysterious founder of the society traveled to Damascus and North Africa, and was there inspired to lead a religious educational reform in Germany. Altogether, a very complex pattern gradually developed, which undermined not only the power but the validity of the European system. Earlier, even centuries before the birth of Muhammad, Arabia had become a refuge for oppressed and persecuted philosophers, mystics, poets, and sectaries. Even heretical Christian groups took refuge in the tolerant atmosphere of Baghdad, and as a result there was a rapid growth in several fields of science and art. There can be no doubt that these overtones contributed to the rise of Islam and made possible much of the glory of the Saracenic and Ottoman empires. Thus it happened that the problems Europe believed to have solved at an earlier date returned with added momentum after the rise of the Caliphate. The Koran itself is not dissimilar in structure to other sacred books, but as always, there were differences which became highly important as the religion grew and spread. It is now believed that all the sections of the Koran were actually dictated by the Prophet during his own lifetime. The arrangement of the surahs, however, is in some instances arbitrary, and resulted from learned counsels by leaders of the faith. We may say, therefore, that the book was compiled over a period of years preceding the Prophet's death in AD 632 or AH 11. To use the Muslim method of recording, it is usual for a strong religious motion to result from a serious crisis in the affairs of a nation or race. In this case, what may be termed Arabian paganism, sometimes gathered under the general term Sabaeism, showed indications of decline. The people of Arabia were gradually falling under the influence of Byzantine Christianity, Judaism, Persian doctrines, and beliefs originating in Abyssinia. Obviously, a small group, the then Arab world, was unable to absorb, reconcile, or interpret these numerous foreign elements. In the presence of too much religion, especially discordant beliefs, there is always a tendency to a bewilderment leading to lack of belief. The citizens of Mecca and Medina were suffering from this confusion, and it is possible to imagine the state of these highly imaginative and intensive Arabs. Muhammad, like most mystics, was evidently born with a seriousness of heart and mind, and could not easily endure the sorry spectacle of religious decadence. He was inwardly offended and outwardly indignant. His marriage to Khadija, reputedly a wealthy widow, resulted in social prominence and the invitation to leadership. Unlike his fellow citizens, Muhammad was not content to protect his own interest or to advance the fortunes which fate had bestowed. Daily he became more introspective and internally confused. Many have attempted to psychoanalyze the Prophet from the text of his book. The conclusion seems to be that he was under a pressure of intensities, which resulted in his illumination. He gradually resolved to attempt a broad religious reform, and there is no doubt that his primary incentives were well justified. He could only follow such knowledge or intuition as was available to him, and seems to have leaned heavily upon the Old Testament and its record of the prophets and patriarchs. In his personal emergency, Muhammad followed the old path of prayer and meditation. There is no evidence whatever to support the feeling that he was insincere or self-seeking. The change that gradually came over him was a profound concern for his family and friends, and by degrees he took them into his confidence. He was convinced that he had a responsibility which could not be shifted or denied. With the approval, therefore, of those most intimately concerned, he retired further into his own nature and practiced his devotions as he felt so impelled. The life of the mystic is closely associated with dreams and visions. In the cave on the side of Mount Hira, Muhammad received his first direct mystical experience. The angel Gabriel appeared to him, confirmed him in his mission, and showed him the surahs of the Koran in luminous letters upon a silken scarf. If we assail this occurrence, we must at the same time, in fairness, question parallel occasions in all the religions of the world. We cannot safely assume in an arbitrary manner that one such revelation is authentic and another unauthentic. Historically, we know that the visions of Muhammad inspired a powerful faith which still is the basis of the spiritual integrity of many nations. It seems wise, therefore, to accept the record and pass on to the interpretation of the consequences. Miniature from a Persian manuscript describing Muhammad's ascent to heaven. The central figure evidently represents the Prophet riding on a cloud of flame with a palm leaf-shaped nimbus behind his head. As is usual, the face is veiled, showing only the tip of his beard. The manuscript is dated 1636. The Quran parallels in so many ways the Old and New Testaments that we must assume that Muhammad was not striving for originality. He did not hold himself up as a peculiarly inspired person, and most of the veneration which he received was neither required nor expected. Several times, especially on his last pilgrimage, Muhammad preached to his followers, assuring them that he was not a Messiah or one peculiarly favored by God. He was a simple man who made his own shoes, rejected all ostentation, and required nothing better than that suitable for the humblest of his followers. There is ample proof that the esteem in which he was held was due to his example and the natural dignity and sincerity of his personal life. The faith of Islam is often referred to as an extreme monotheism. Today, the cry of the muezzin is the same as it was 1400 years ago. Allah is great. There is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is the Prophet of Allah. There was rigid insistence upon the basic principle of the unity and absolute sovereignty of the divine power. This power reaches into the hearts of men, and those who are possessed by this power become prophets. In so doing, however, they never cease to be men. They can suffer and die the same as other mortals. Their whole strength lies in the God presence in their own hearts and souls. No amount of virtue or of wisdom or of understanding changes these basic relationships in the Islamic world. Some men may be more virtuous in their conduct than others, but they must still remain submissive to the will of God and be content to serve when and where God sees fit. This position shows clearly the reform Muhammad was attempting to bring about. He opposed the old faith of his people with its many gods and Christianity with its messianic dispensation. At the same time, Muhammad revealed a profound admiration for the life and ministry of Jesus. He in no way blamed the gentle Nazarene for the later dilemmas of the church. As a mystic, Muhammad felt the wonderful sincerity of Jesus, but he doubted if others, especially the theologians, were inwardly conscious of the faith that Jesus had promulgated. Thus, in the Islamic world, Jesus is revered as a great prophet, but not as an incarnation of deity. The moral codes and statutes of the Quran are heavily colored by the Mosaic law, and this followed into the priesthood, which held to the Jewish persuasion that the priest was essentially a teacher rather than an intermediary between God and man. In Islam, worship is thrown squarely upon the believer. He is required to grow in grace from within himself. This probably explains why the formal structure of Islam has never been strongly unified. The mystic sects, which inevitably developed in the Muslim world, sustain their own positions by the direct authority of the life and teachings of the Prophet. The revelation of the Quran occurred under highly mystical conditions, and the purity and humility of the Prophet justified the assumption that he was devoted to an inner kind of experience and guidance. This resulted in the peculiar sphere of influence attained by the dervishes and other related sects. It is not possible that these groups could have survived without early sanction and support. Here, again, there are traces of Nestorianism and those Christian sects which were forced into the Arabian desert because of their mystical persuasions. Muhammad traveled considerably along the caravan routes in the management of his business, and had the opportunity to meet and know the small communities of recluses and hermit monks. In its present form, the Quran consists of 114 chapters, each of which has a title and a statement of the place at which it was revealed. Experts are of the opinion that the sections reflect strongly the period in the Prophet's career at which the surahs were written. There is also a unique factor in that certain verses were abrogated, that is, removed, revoked, and another revelation put in their place. Much has been made of the way in which the surahs were dictated. Apparently, they were accompanied by unusual physical symptoms. The Prophet seemed to pass into a kind of trance in which he perspired excessively, and it was necessary to wrap him in warm blankets or robes. The words which were spoken were carefully recorded, and Muhammad's suffering was also duly remembered. On one occasion, he referred to the agony of revelation when he said that each white hair in his beard was a surah of the Koran. There seems little ground, however, for the belief that the Prophet suffered from some nervous ailment. An almost identical record describes the peculiar agony of spirit which possessed the Egyptian reformer, Pharaoh Akhenaten. It is certain that Muhammad's health was affected to the alarm of his associates. He also seems to have had a premonition that his religion would be the cause of his death, and we know that his end was hastened by poisoning. After the death of the Prophet, it appeared that some parts of his instruction had not been committed to writing. The secretary of the Prophet, Zayd ibn Thabit, was entrusted to assemble all of the sections and verses into one volume. For some time, apparently, only this one copy of the Quran existed. Later, this same Zayd was appointed to revise his previous compilation. This became the standard text, and most of the earlier manuscripts were destroyed. Thus, there can be some doubt on particular aspects of the work. But as these revisions are early, they would not have been accepted had they deviated too widely from the popular tradition. One of the elements which strongly supports the sincerity of Muhammad was the complete lack of a formal plan in his own mind during the early years of his ministry. Even the revelation of the Quran did not immediately lead to any vital results. The Prophet, wrapped in his blankets, spoke like an oracle. It is not certain that he required or intended the words to be written. He spoke only to his most intimate friends, and this small group at his instruction kept the entire program with utmost secrecy. It seems that the listeners were the ones who decided that utterances should be preserved. This is why some parts were in oral tradition only until a later date. The context seems to have moved with some continuity from a religious level to one of more immediate utility. There can be no doubt that the new problems that arose influenced the direction of the teaching. Always, however, it was immediate and concerned with the problems of Arabia. There is nothing to indicate that Muhammad expected the doctrine to extend to other nations. Even the time of its duration is only intimated on a philosophic level. He was moved mostly to provide a solution to a conflict raging around him and to a degree within him. In the centuries that followed, the Quran took on many unique qualities. Of all sacred books, it has become the most beautiful in terms of artistry. The Arabic writing is extremely decorative, rhythmic and graceful. There are several different scripts, and the illumined pages of fine manuscript are works of art. The written form lends itself to exquisite internal patterns, and is not like our printed text, which is generally restricted. Prayers take the forms of arabesques, and verses of the Quran have been wonderfully inlaid in semi-precious stones and precious metals into the arches of mosques and the doors of shrines. Due to the teaching itself, the Quran may not be illustrated, as it was against the wish of the Prophet that the human form be reproduced in religious art. This admonition led to the disfiguring of ancient artworks in areas which came under Islamic control. Floral motifs were acceptable, however, and it is not unusual to find the words of the Prophet unfolded through elaborate floral devices. Pilgrim's cloak decorated with extracts from the Quran. This elaborate religious vestment is said to contain all the important sections of the Muslim scripture and was made in the late 17th or early 18th century. Many scribes devoted their lives to making copies of the Quran. Some are known to have gone blind in their zeal. The older copies are simpler than those after the 12th century, and in order to show graphically these transitions, we have selected several pages from different periods and produced them herewith. Even in its printed form, the Quran is a fascinating example of the combination of calligraphy and typography. We have in the library a pilgrim's cloak decorated with extensive sections of the Quran. Also, we have a small roll, usually carried in a kind of amulet, containing selected prayers from the larger work. There is a class of art in which a verse is actually fashioned into a picture. The writing, usually in large, bold letters, is against a background of delicate gold design. Surrounding the inscription is a highly decorative border touched with many colors and sprays of gold, which make the whole composition resemble a burst of light. It is important at this time to briefly summarize the doctrinal aspects of the Quran. We have already intimated its principal overtone as absolute monotheism. The revelation takes the form of admonition, God is made to speak and to tell the faithful his will for his creatures. The book, therefore, carries the implication of final authority on numerous disputed subjects. Obviously, there is not the possibility of such authority being accepted by other religions. Yet for the most part, there's little in the Quran that is basically in conflict with the Old Testament or the doctrinal parts of the New Testament. Muhammad revealed to the faithful that in the fullness of time another prophet would come, whose name was to be Ahmed, the desired of all nations. Those who kept the law and obeyed the revelation which Muhammad had brought would benefit both materially and spiritually. He enjoined his followers to keep the simple virtues of honesty, integrity, and fraternity. Only those who lived constructively would be acceptable in the sight of God. There are some controversial points, and we shall select a few as indicative. There is considerable interest in the fourth surah revealed at Medina. This is partly concerned with the spiritual, moral, and legal rights of women. While in our day, the code set forth in the Quran may not appear exactly progressive, it was a distinct improvement over the general perspective of that time. The devotion of Muhammad for Khadijah is reflected in the doctrine. The rights of women are clearly set forth, and it is a mistake to assume that popular policies relating to the condition of Eastern women are required or sustained by the Quran. Most of all, the spiritual right of woman is strongly emphasized, and this may be considered in conflict with the general trend of religious writings. The Quran has been divided into 4 general institutes. The broad foundations of faith are associated with the earliest periods of revelations. Under the second heading are listed the procedures and forms of worship. Under the third, the ethics or code of conduct. And under the fourth, the moral burden of the teaching unfolded through legends, myths, fables, parables, and historical incidents. The career of Muhammad as revealed through the writings is also divisible into 3 epics, which correspond very closely with the growth of Christianity. The first epic reveals Muhammad as unfolding his own belief and setting in motion the spiritual concept of his religion. In the second epic, the faith took on a more aggressive form and moved against the idolatrous system and other sects within the Muslim sphere of influence. In the third epic, Muhammad emerged as a ruler over his people, as the prince of the faithful, with both spiritual and temporal power. His attitude became paternal, and the believers were regarded as his children. As necessary, he made new laws and revised those which had previously been given. Thus, the Quran differs from other religious writings in that it involves the actual biography of a man and all the vicissitudes of the faith he was building. Some have said that the Quran is a sacred, commonplace book combining doctrine and diary. Muhammad did not seem to object to revealing the transitions in his own nature inevitable to the development of his message. The Quran, a leaf in Kufic script on vellum Egypt, 9th century. In this specimen, which was written prior to the addition of diacritical marks and points, a later scribe had added these to simplify the reading of the text. It may be well to quote a few lines from the Quran relating to Christianity. The Prophet writes, "The Messiah, Jesus, the son of Mary, is but the apostle of God and his word, which he cast into Mary, and a spirit from him. Believe then in God and his apostles, and say not 3. Have done, it were better for you. God is only one God." By 3, of course, Muhammad opposed Trinitarianism, and this may be said to be the main charge against him. Another complaint is that he sanctioned an aggressive militant program, but in this, he only followed his interpretation of the Old Testament. He was not a warlike man himself, and his biographers question whether he ever carried a sword except as an insignia of rank. If we transpose ourselves to the time in which Muhammad lived, I think we will find that he was a powerful, constructive influence. We may disagree with some of his opinions, but his sincerity and dedication to his cause distinguish him as one of the world's great leaders. Thank you for watching, and please don't forget to share, like, subscribe, and comment. And if you can, please consider donating to Wars of the Roses. Links to PayPal and Patreon are in the description. Thank you so very much.